So, Rich, here we are, Wandsworth, South London. One of your favourites, if not your favourite restaurant. I've been here before as well. Chez Bruce. How does it feel?
It feels amazing, as it always does, as it did the first time I had lunch in here with my mate Andy in 1998. So here we are 23 years later. Obviously, I can't tell you visually what it looks like, but the vibe is still fantastic. It's just, beautiful tablecloths. It maybe feels a little bit smarter than it did 23 years ago. I was here a few months ago and had a sensational meal with Liz and a couple of friends, and I'm pretty sure our lunch today is going to be quite special. This is a landmark, and for a restaurant here, it's not in the centre of town. This place has retained its Michelin star for all that time, so it's doing something right. And what I love about this restaurant, before we've even had a drop of wine or anything to eat, is the warmth, the buzz, the vitality, but also the relaxed vibe as you come in, and the staff are so professional but informal. There's zero stuffiness here. It's just to die for restaurant, isn't it?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I have been here before, and I don't remember it as well as you do, but it's lovely. It's light. Everybody's just pleasant, like you say, professional but not stuffy, which is, it sounds easy, but I think that's not an easy trick to pull off.
You just cannot help but have a smile on your face and think life is good when you're here. It's lovely.
Well, hello, and welcome to the final, for now at least, episode of The Wine List with me, Oliver Turnbull, and of course, Richard Lane. And what could be better than for the final episode for us to tootle off down to southwest London to one of our favourite restaurants, Chez Bruce. Also the supplier, of course, of the wine list that we've been using for reference throughout the entire series. Well, we sat down there and we had, Rich, it was really rather a spectacular lunch, wasn't it?
Hi there, all. Yeah, it was pretty lovely, wasn't it? A very special way to end the season, as you say. I have to say, goodness me, there we were, treated to a lovely table in the middle of the restaurant. The staff were fantastic, and when it came to, dreaded old bill time, we weren't even allowed to see the bill. So huge thanks to Bruce Poole, as in Mr. Bruce, Mr. Chez Bruce, for all their hospitality and for their, cooperation during season one.
Utterly lovely. So, but we have a special treat, don't we, to tickle our taste buds for the last episode, haven't we, Rich?
Oh, we certainly do have. We're in terms of a little tawny port. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, I am. The Society's exhibition, 10-year-old tawny port, matured in wood, which always sounds good, but we'll talk about why that's a good thing. Selected and shipped, of course, for the Wine Society. Yes, it's come from Portugal, I'm glad to say, because I always assume port comes from Portugal, but actually, does it have to?
Oh, Oliver, your powers of deduction really extraordinary. Portugal? Well done. Yeah, absolutely. Just a tiny thing on the history, because it is quite interesting. There's been a fantastic relationship between Portugal and England / Great Britain over centuries.
Oh, it's half a millennium. Yeah, it's I think I'm right in saying they are our longest standing continual ally, possibly in the world, but certainly in Europe. It's like 500 years. It's extraordinary.
Absolutely, because at various times we've been at war with Spain and or France and all the rest of it. So our kind of route, our trade route for getting French wine and Spanish wine at various stages has been cut off. But we've always got on well with the Portuguese. And so this thriving trade of port wine, this fantastic fortified style of wine, has been alive and kicking literally for centuries. And there are some port families with English names who have been living in the Douro Valley in northern Portugal for hundreds of years, making this stuff, shipping this stuff, trading this stuff. It seemed a good place to kind of drop off our final voyage, if you like, to drop into port.
And it's fortified wine, and I think I know what that is, but I'd rather you say the proper definition. It's fortified with a spirit, and it's quite delicious, and you have it at the end of the meal. I smelt a little bit. It just reminded me of Christmas.
Oh, well, it's, of course, port has all these wonderful associations, Christmas being a good one. So basically, it's wine that starts its fermentation in the usual way. So let's take red port. It's made from black grapes. Usually, they're called port grape varieties. I won't name them all, but often it's 5 grape varieties. And the fermentation starts, as we know how, with red to get the colour. That means lots of extractions of colour and of tannin from those grapes. But the interesting thing with port is fermentation is usually stopped when there's only 5% alcohol which means obviously that there's a lot of sugar left behind, that the yeast hasn't already converted the sugar to alcohol. Clearly, if you've only got 5% alcohol from grapes that would be sort of 12, 13 or 14% if they were fermented to dryness. So by stopping the fermentation at 5%, and you're thinking, how do you stop it? Well, you add this blinking spirit called aguardente, which is about 77%, to be precise, alcohol by volume. That spirit kills the yeast straight away, so the yeast cannot carry on fermenting. You've got this obviously quite sweet liquid, and of course you're fortifying it from, as I said, from around 5% up to around 20% is average for most ports. So quite boozy. And you think about it, if your glass of port is 20% alcohol, of which 5% is only coming from the ordinary fermentation, that means 15% of your 20%, 75% of your port glass is spirit, which is why one has to go a bit easy with the old port. It's definitely not a session drink.
No, indeed. So I know about tawny port and I know about ruby port, but actually I don't know the difference.
Oh, sure. Well, tawny obviously refers to the colour. When you have a ruby port, it's pretty red, isn't it? Like red wine, like a deep ruby. You can pick up a bottle of ordinary ruby port in the supermarket or wine shop for around £7 or £8. You can also pick up a kind of supermarket £7 or £8, quotes tawny port. Actually a bit of a cheat, because it really is ruby port that's just had the colour stripped out of it.
Really?
Yeah. Proper tawny port is to do with the way the wine is matured. And for ruby ports, which are red to begin with and stay red, and the reason they remain red is that they don't see much oxygen, if any oxygen at all, during their maturation before they're sold to consumers. Basically, it's quite simple. Most ruby ports, whether they become superb vintage ports that bottle age often for years or even decades before they're released, or whether it's just a simple bottle of fiery ruby port that you pick up, as I say, for £7 or £8, they are basically matured in a pretty oxygen-free environment, and that's what enables them to retain their colour. Tawny ports, true tawny ports, as I said, not these cheaty ones that you get, are aged in wood, going back to your wood-aged definition on this Wine Society 10-year-old tawny port that we are tasting today. And that basically means that when the wine has been made, its maturation takes place in wood. It could be oak barrels. In Portugal, they call them pipes. They are enormous wooden vessels that can hold hundreds of litres of port. And by maturing them in wood rather than in stainless steel, which is the vessels that ruby port would go into, it's the wooden pipes that enable or allow the passage, the very slight passage of oxygen through the walls of the wood into the wine, which very gently oxidizes the wine. And that's why the colour starts to disappear as a result of the oxidation process. And the flavours of a tawny port are quite different to a ruby port. And we'll taste our tawny port in a moment. You get this lovely sort of raisined kind of flavour profile, often tasting of kind of currants and molasses and that sort of thing. It's a really oxidized taste, whereas ruby port, whether it's a simple ruby or a vintage port that's been bottle aged for many years, hasn't seen any wood at all, will still taste of primary fruit, of red fruits and black fruits and other things like that. So it's all to do with the maturation process of the port.
Brilliant. Very clear. So what was very, very surprising is that cheap tawny port is a bit of a rip-off, because it's actually ruby port made to look tawny. And is it because people like the look of tawny and they think a tawny port is going to be...
It's a bit like pale pink rosé. Sorry, I mustn't bang on about that again, but you get the point.
Exactly.
Appearances mattering. And it is quite interesting, actually, Ol, that appearances matter with this sort of cheat tawny port. Yeah, absolutely. People like the look of a tawny port because it looks aged and there's some sort of quality assessment or judgment made to a port that's looking a bit tawny. Generally speaking, with the exception of vintage ports, a vintage port means that it's such a good harvest. The grapes are so amazing. The way it works is the port producers declare a vintage, and they don't usually declare it for a couple of years. They want to see how the port's getting on when it's made. But when they think they're going to have a superb quality port, they declare the vintage. Most of the port producers, they don't have to all declare it, but quite often they do. So you'll get certain years where, quote, a vintage port is declared, and vintage ports that have the word vintage written on it will come from 1 year. But generally speaking, port, a bit like our non-vintage champagne, is made across different vintages. Again, blending often for house style, so that you can get a consistent house style for certain houses to have a particular taste profile by blending across different vintages. That's fine, we understand that. To answer answer your question, how do you know if you're not being ripped off when it comes to a tawny or a ruby? Well, the price will be a good indication. A bottle for £7 or £8 and you see it in the supermarket, then that's just a basic ruby or a basic tawny port. The quotes cheats tawny port. Once you get to tawny ports that have other ports that have an age indication, like this one has an indication of 10 years, it means this tawny port wine from the Wine Society is roughly the wine around 10 years of age. It means that it's from vintages around maybe 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years ago. Ditto, you'll get an age indication for 20 years. And they cost a bit more because the maturation's gone on for longer. The wine spent more time in oak barrels, more oxygen's got in. You might have some more nuanced, interesting flavours. Plus, of course, wine that hangs around, not being sold in bottles, is costing space. So time is money sort of thing. So the older the port, the more expensive it is. You just need to look at the label.
Really good explanation. Great. I'm learning all the time. Fabulous. I think I know enough now, and that was relatively quick and simple and painless.
Good. Should we have let's have a little nose of our porthole, and then I think we need to just do our little quick resume of the series and look at our learning points that we've picked up from the series.
Oh, it's definitely tawny. There's no doubt. Oh, it's a lovely colour.
Tell me about the colour,
Absolutely no doubt.
because I kind of know in my head what tawny is, but I'd love you to describe this colour to me.
How am I going to do this? I mean, obviously you have had 23 years of sight, is my reckoning. Oh, it smells lovely. It smells like Christmas. It smells like back home. Yeah, it's a slightly watered down red, but not in a bad way, your tawny. And there's a sort of browny redness to it. So sepia, could I say sepia maybe?
Okay.
So, there's those lovely sepia photographs you get of people standing awkwardly in Victorian poses. Sort of like that.
I remember discovering some photographs from my grandparents' era or even my great-grandparents' era, and extraordinary. Yes, that sort of slight muzziness at the edges, fuzziness at the edges. For my nose, there's something really raisiny about the aromas. Do you know what I mean? That's sort of... the smell of chocolates and raisins that we had as kids. There's that really sort of sweet raisiny smell.
It's almost Christmas cakey, and then this might be my mind playing
fantastic.
tricks.
That is it.
Dried fruit and
spices.
I'm not sure about the marzipan and spices. There you go. Exactly.
It's the marzipan, maybe a touch of butterscotch, maybe a touch of what's that lovely nutmeg, those baking spices you have in the cake, dried fruits, dried almonds, dried apricots.
There's little cubes of nondescript dried fruit in quotes, and you wonder what they...
Yes, absolutely.
Cubes of matter, fruity matter.
I've just had a small sip. I've actually got a bit of a cold, which I'm not going to moan on about. And you know what? We've got a little bit of a cold. Just a tiny sip of... Oh, wow, feel good. Marvellous.
So what is surprising, and maybe I just haven't been so tuned before, is the sort of burning, warm sensation. It's the spiciness and the explosion in the mouth that you get more, it seems, from this fortification than you do even from one of those full-bodied wines that we've tried.
Oh, absolutely.
It's just a lovely explosion of taste and warmth and spiciness and cake coming through. Yum.
You've summed it up. I mean, basically, the mixing bowl, when your mum was making Christmas cake, before the cake was sort of put in the oven, this is what it smells of.
I think I might be a tawny convert, but I will probably try a ruby again, just to make sure. It's nice to be able to say, no, I prefer a tawny port, and then have some explanation as to why. Because, of course, this whole series has been built around making me look like a smart ass at dinner parties and not a complete numpty.
Of course. Oh, yes.
We're getting there.
Oh, that's right. The premise of the series. I think this is an opportune moment, for a little bit of reflection, not overly indulgent, but I mean, it is important. This is the last ep. It's the time to ask some questions if you're doing any project, whether it's a work project or a social project or something for fun. You do occasionally have to go back and say, what were our original objectives, and have we achieved any of them?
Right. Yeah, and I think we'll probably find we've achieved different objectives. We've certainly headed towards the main objective, which was the wine list, which was just to sort of keep it simple so that people could grasp on to what we were going on about in the series. But it was a bit broader than that in the sense of introducing someone to a lot more aspects of wine. So not just the taste and the selection from a wine list, but a little bit about history, geography, all those sciences that you mentioned earlier on that contribute to making this thing. I think we've covered them all pretty well at a relatively superficial level, but I don't think we ever wanted to make this some sort of doctorate.
No, not at all. The Wine List podcast is there for people like you all who like a glass of wine, sound like you in one of your intros, who know. They like a glass of wine, but would like to know a little bit more. And of course, and that is the objective, and has been the objective all along. It's not some serious academic kind of treatment of the details or nuances of wine. We've had to go into some detail. Perhaps my first observation would be, when I go back, and I'll play a couple of clips in a minute of things that we said in the earlier episodes, and I think it rather neatly summarizes where you were, particularly 10 episodes ago anyway. And I think just by hearing a little bit of the things you were saying and I was saying in episode 1 gives us an indication as to how far you have come. Not that this is an exam or a course and you've got to be anywhere, but I think it's just a lovely little illustration really, of the journey that we've been on. So let's just have a little listen to a couple of clips from the early eps.
This thing is probably 30 pages long. So if I was presented with this on the table, not only would there be not much room for my bread and butter, but there's just page after page of wine, which would make me, almost come out in a cold sweat. The Spanish wine, Portugal wine, Germany wine, Austrian wine, the rest of Europe and the Balkans white as a whole section. And of course, the South African, American and French just runs to about 5 pages on its own. And there's a whole page of Beaujolais, a whole page of Bordeaux, and then on page 15, Regional France Red, different sides of the river as well. I couldn't believe it. There we go. Let me see what I'm smelling. God, it's really difficult, I feel like I've got an uncultured nose.
No, Oliver, it's only episode 1. It's all right.
By episode 10, I'll be getting black stars. I'm hoping. What do you think? Do you think my palate might get trained a little over these weeks if I'm really, concentrating on it?
I think your palate will be in a better place, hopefully, in 10 episodes' time than it is now. What about the finish, Ol?
Well, I'd love to comment if I knew what on earth you were talking about. How can a wine have a finish?
Happy memories.
Golly, I can't believe I said some of those things.
Well, you definitely did say those things, Ol. The microphone never lies. Talking of which, this is what you were saying yesterday to our sommelier in Chez Bruce, Victor, when it came to choosing our wines.
Well, seeing as I fell off a horse recently, a horse called Rocky, I was looking down there and I couldn't believe that there's a white. I know it's got some Roussin in it. Rocking horse?
Yeah, rocking horse. So as you may know, Roussin is a Northern Rhone grape varietal, white, and it can show a certain amount of ripeness. But the Semillon gives it backbone and structure. You get that acidity that comes through. Props the wine up, essentially.
You said props the wine up? You mean in the backbone? How would you mean by that?
So with Northern Rhone whites, sometimes you struggle balancing acidity and a certain ripeness. These grape varieties ripen quick, and if you don't pick, you struggle to have an acidity that gives that backbone. So when I say props the wine up, it actually gives it support. The Semillon provides the acidity and the Roussin provides the ripeness.
I can get that. This gentleman talks like you, Richard, and describes things kindly, just like you do.
Super. Well, we'll have a carafe of that, please.
Absolutely.
Would be brilliant. A quick resume of the Epsol. Episode 1 clearly was all about starting off in your relative comfort zones. That's why we started with New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc and with good old-fashioned claret. You acknowledged, even at the end of episode 1, that the claret wasn't of particularly good quality. I think of the Wine Society's claret. And that was the only Bordeaux wine that we tasted in the series. So probably not doing Bordeaux many favours, actually. But anyway.
I remember the claret tasted like home. Sunday lunch at ours, if it was a red meat, would always be accompanied with a claret, which I was allowed to taste. And the Sauv Blanc was, yes, a familiarity. I think that is the thing I remember about Ep10. It was a really good selection of wines because I felt comfortable, because I knew where I was. Let's explore something a little bit outside this comfort zone.
That's it, and that's important actually, because a lot of people don't get out of episode 1. A lot of consumers stay with what they know because people like what they know, and they're concerned or fearful or slightly anxious about making a choice into a field they know nothing about, and the last thing you want to do is spend quite a few quid on a bottle of wine and not enjoy it. So people get stuck at home base.
Not renowned for their exquisite wines. Probably you could buy the materials to build a wine rack or something. What was the wine that we ate with the sushi? We're certainly looking out for that now. Me and Louise had a lovely time eating sushi and drinking
indeed.
That wine. And it was a German wine, wasn't it?
That was the Riesling from Dr. Lucen.
Of course, Dr. Lucen's Riesling.
Which had some sweetness, so that's when you started tackling your prejudice about sweet wine and tried pairing it with sushi, you and Louise, and you reported back with very favourable results, I remember. So yeah, that was Dr. Lewson's Riesling, which came up in our history app, which was episode 4, because that was fun, because history is interesting anyway. It was a bit of a romp, admittedly, but also it did remind us that some wines and some grape varieties, their roots go back hundreds of years. Riesling being an obvious example in Germany, which is why we chose that one. And we were also in Greece, and we tasted that wine, the grape variety Gina Mavro, which you absolutely loved. It was a red wine that was quite pale, if you remember, and you were very excited about it. And we talked about some really crazy food pairings like a pizza. We did also say we could have it with fish, and that talked about red wine and fish. So even though we didn't focus on food seriously till episode 9, we were starting to talk about food, and that all kicked off with Riesling and sushi, absolutely. Episode 2, we did talk about geography, and it was called 3050. And I felt that was a good start for you as well, because you got to see how natural factors underpin a lot of what goes on or what is possible in the wine world. Is that right?
Yeah, it was nice shorthand for understanding where wine's going to grow well, obviously, which I had heard of before, but I'd studied it a little bit more, particularly in the Southern Hemisphere. And then we talked about Argentina, I remember, and how there are other factors at play, including even proximity to the ocean, as I recall, but also how high you are up as well. So you can sort of deviate from the 30-50 latitude rule, if you had other factors going on, like altitude, etc.
Moderating influences such as altitude. So that's why in Cafayate in Argentina, this region, you can be almost in the tropics at 22 degrees latitude. But then when you're at 2,500 meters, it's kind of fine, because as we discussed, and you love the stat, I remember, every 100 meters you go up, you drop 0.6 degrees centigrade temperature.
Oh, golly. And that reminded me of the compromises you make in photography with aperture exposure, the amount of light that's going on, etc. And those compromises you make to make a different photo. And I remember we were talking to Gabby yesterday from Sip It, the people who do those wine experiences so well. And she was talking about wine from Mexico. In the old days, I'd have gone, Mexico wine, that just doesn't sound right. It doesn't sound like a winemaking country. But it's actually nothing to do with their history or the economics or what they're famous for. It's to do with whether they have the right climate to grow the grapes at the right speed to create cool wine.
Exactly that. And I really note to ourselves that we will taste some Mexican wine in the next incarnation of the wine list. And Ep2, just very briefly, was also we tasted a Chardonnay from Chile, and we talked about the anything but Chardonnay movement, which again is all about perceptions and people thinking they don't like Chardonnay, therefore they'll never order it, sort of thing, which was interesting because, of course, as you identified, I think, because you did your homework, Chardonnay, the most versatile of all the grape varieties. It makes blinking Chablis. How delicious is Chablis? And of course, talking of Chablis, I don't want to linger on it, but I mean, it was a little bit mean of me to give you a blind taste in Ep3. And I felt as though, in cricketing terms, you looked good at the wicket if you were a batsman. You know, you had composure, you looked the part. Unfortunately, you didn't manage to score any runs.
That's a nice analogy. I felt I was making some progress, even though it was also a bit binary as well.
It was.
In my favour.
Yeah, no, totally. And that was episode 3, La Belle France. Whilst we talked a lot about Chablis, and we were obviously talking about quality levels and can you taste quality, which was what the Chablis thing was all about. What you did in the second part of that ep was really interesting, is that you clearly noticed the difference between a fairly basic, well-made, basic Côte du Rhône, and you contrasted that with the Gigandin, which was just a completely different beast, much higher quality, much more complexity, and you spotted that really, really well, and that was at the end of Ep3. So despite the exam result in Ep3, I think actually you came a long way.
But I do remember thinking, hang on a minute, if you concentrate and smell and really focus on the two senses, I suppose it's mostly smell and taste, you can detect massive, incredible, profound differences between the things you're drinking. And that's one of the things I'm going to take away from the series, which is, you know, getting yourself immersed in the sensual experience, which sounds unbearably pretentious, but it's lovely. It's a really, really interesting thing to want to do. I liken it to really looking at a painting, really understanding a painting, what the artist is trying to say, getting absorbed in the painting. Again, things that I found utterly pretentious just a few weeks ago, I now go, I'm starting to get what they mean.
Well, that is terrific. Ep4 we've already touched upon. It was our gallop through history, but to spare a word for this rather nasty chap who appeared at the end of the 19th century, I think you called him Phil, didn't you?
Phylloxera, nasty geezer.
What was interesting, and you appreciated this too, is out of something terrible, a decimation of the worldwide vineyards back end of the 19th, early 20th century. Some good actually came out of it. I mean, okay, some people may question whether the evolution of Appellation Contrôlée was a good thing when it came along in the 1930s, bringing along potential confusion, rules and regulations and bureaucracy and stuff that sometimes people associate with French culture. But obviously what it did was, as you know, and as you told us in your homework in a later episode, Richard, Appellation Contrôlée is not an indication of quality, it's an indication of
authenticity, my friend. Authenticity.
In wine terms, that's a terroir-based system which has caught on a bit around the world, even though the regs don't exist in the New World. And we talked a lot about the New World and the Old World. I really enjoyed that ep and your homework there on the judgment of Paris. But I mean, it was basically, as we said in that ep, it was how the rules, if you like, and the kind of understanding of terroir in the Old World had a major influence on the New World, but the New World could explode on the scene, understanding terroir, but without being tied up in knots with it because they don't have the same legislation. And as a result of that, the New World has recently made the Old World up its game. So I think that Brave New World's ep, and your judgment of Paris, I think appearing in the middle of the series was a good place.
It's always quite nice when the young upstart, through just hard work, determination, and putting together a really good product, such as the old hermit crab, I remember, that Chester Osborne gave us, and taking on the old boys and making them up their game. I think it's a great story.
But I just want to hear your really quite passable Australian accent. Here it is.
This is an good old Australian wine, the hermit crab. I also like the names of Australian wines as well. They're sort of down to earth and a bit quirky and a bit, I'd just have a glass of the old hermit crab. You got the crabs there, I see, mate, and you can imagine the humour. Yeah, I think I could do better, but it's very kind of you. Very kind of you.
And then you put on a little bit of a South African accent, which I won't play, in the next step, which was called The Beauty of the Earth. And this was the first of a couple of really quite long eps. But of course, we did really get under the skin of viticulture, grape growing, the agricultural business of grape growing with its inherent risks, and obviously winemaking, what goes on inside. And certainly as a student, I felt I'd put too much emphasis on what goes on inside the winery, and I didn't give as much thought or respect. But the more I learn about wine, and by the way, I'm learning more about wine almost since I've got my diploma than before, because I'm just exploring it all the time, including doing the podcast with you. It's really helped me learn. The blinking winemaking goes on in the vineyard. The viticulture is so crucial.
Oh, blimey, yeah. I mean, I suppose I always assumed that, but I love understanding the factors, the soil, the aspect, and how some of the most well-respected and famous vineyards are actually quite small. So they seem to be the coming together of loads of beautiful factors all in one place, but also the science as well that we went into. So it's the way the grapes are grown and then the way the grapes are turned into wine. And it reminded me wholeheartedly that I'm quite glad I'm a management consultant and not a wine grower, because the variability in terms of my income would drive me nuts and it would not let me sleep.
Yeah. Scary old business. I think you said in the app you kind of need to be a certain type of character probably to be a grape grower in the wine business, because of all the inherent risks. The fact that a hailstorm could just come along one afternoon and kill your crop, or birds could attack it, or all the rest of it.
Right.
All these variables, let alone the blinking frosts and heat waves and droughts and all the rest of it.
You could be having your supper and a hailstone comes, you go, oh, mad. That's naught income this year, pretty much. There's no way. It's quite good that you've put alternative titles to the episode as well, like the historical romp. The next one is olfactory. I thought that's very hilarious. Play on words, where my olfactory bulb finally comes into its own, rather than my amygdala, which has been more of the focus of my life up until that point. That was the one, wasn't it, where we studied the system for the different flavours?
That's right. That's when we borrowed the Wine and Spirit Education Trust, WSET's systematic approach to tasting, brackets SAT, level 2, copyright. By Ep7, you'd have enough experience of tasting from the first 6 Eps to A, be making some progress, B, we'd had a big Ep obviously talking about the importance of viticulture and how that's linked to winemaking. So we could then really focus on tasting, as we did with those 4 wines, and this incredible linkage, but the biology, if you like, the neurobiology and the psychology and all the rest of it, of smell and taste, and how important smell is, how basically fairly primitive our tongues and our taste receptors are in our tongues, and how all the work is done, really starts, not all the work, but the majority of work is done towards the back of the mouth, going up the sinus and towards the olfactory bulb in the brain, where all these amazing sensors are sort of disentangled, interpreted by the brain. This comes back to your point about how you've learnt how to focus now more on the smell and taste of a wine, and that this is part of your enjoyment. And we have obviously I've talked about things like turning the music off and the radio off sometimes, so you can actually concentrate, really concentrate on what you're doing. I mean, it's a bit extreme, it's a bit antisocial doing that, but one can do it, because ultimately we are talking about the human senses. That's why we're here. Off the back of the series, we were then into Pink and Fizz territory, which I enjoyed.
Oh, blimey, that reminds me of my confession that I have to make.
Oh, good. Do you want to make it now, dear boy, or later?
Well, I think perhaps I should. I mean, you kept on saying throughout the series, and obviously you can't see me through Zoom, particularly when we had those 4 wines in Ep10, you kept on saying, don't forget the spittoon. So, Rich, I haven't got a spittoon.
What? He says, spitting into his spittoon. That's me.
I don't own one. I haven't used one, and I've been drinking the wine all season. And so I remember episode 7 feeling like I probably needed a snooze after that. Not something to show off about, but I feel you have to know.
Well, confession time over. I will think about punishment in due course. Shocked by that revelation. Ep10, Pink and Fizz, lovely. Not least because you surprised me with your really quite sophisticated knowledge about champagne based on stuff your dad used to occasionally give you. I thought that was terrific.
Not that we were extremely well off or anything, but my dad really appreciated enjoyment of the finer things in life, if you like, as a sort of working class man-made good. We were wondering whether that was an advantage or a disadvantage, because my earlier exposure to alcohol had been to quite high quality champagne, and the same with the red wine. Everything post that has then been a bit of a disappointment when it comes to sparkling wine. I don't really get much out of Prosecco, for example.
Fun and fruity, just like you. And I think your expression was there's not much going on, or it's just a bit simple. So yeah, we talked a little bit about that in the rosé and the champagne, but I was surprised actually how much I like the rosé, and how much the colour of the rosé doesn't really have much bearing on quality, which is again sort of a bit like a cheap tawny. Just very briefly mention food and wine. We might just pop back to Chez Bruce for a moment. So, Mr. Oliver, you have had a fishy lunch here at Chez Bruce, and it is Friday, you good Catholic boy you, with your tuna spring rolls and your Cornish hake. Delicious?
Amazing. I love the spring rolls. They do what an appetizer should do, which is make you slightly more hungry. But they were delicious. The hake was nice. Maybe I could have taken more seasoning. I did like it a lot, and the wines complemented it beautifully.
Excellent. And as you're considering your chocolate fondant pudding...
yes, I was going to say, Rich, I have a confession to make. You know the sweet wine thing. I'm not sure whether I like it. With a dessert, I'm not against a dessert wine. Definitely not. So I'm flicking through the enormous wine list here. And can you believe, even dessert wines, there's, if you include Madeira and Port, 2 pages of them at the Chez Bruce menu.
Lovely.
France is the biggest contributor to the dessert wine list. But I don't know where to go after that. I think you've mentioned Bordeaux before.
Well, I'm sorry to stick in France, which is the obvious thing to do, but I'm just going to be a bit self-indulgent, because it does take me back to the time that Liz and Topper and I were in southwest France. Sauternes is the Bordeaux wine, the sweet wine that everyone's heard of. Montbazillac is the sweet wine you have in Bergerac. I don't think there's a Montbazillac. I did look at the menu online on the train. By the way, it took me an hour to get here, up from Farnham to southwest London, no sweat. I still didn't manage to read the whole of the wine list in an hour. Admittedly, with the voiceover app on the phone reading it to me, but I have the voice set quite fast, and I got to about page 90 of 111. That's the way it's split it up on my phone. Can we look at the Bordeaux? What have we got?
Yeah, there's 3. There's the Sauternes, as you suggested there might be. There's a Lupiac, lovely mid-price, and your coffee's just arrived, by the way. And then there's a Chateau, and there's a very difficult word. It's Chateau Yquem. That's also a Sauternes, but a Premier Cru.
Chateau d'Yquem. Hang on, you said the second one ended in ac.
Lupiac, Cuvée d'Or, Dauphin, Rondillon.
We must please have the Lupiac, because one of my overriding memories about living in France, in southwest France, is the local sort of indigenous historic language, which is called Occitan. And that means everything ends in AC, like Bergerac and Carnac. Well, that's in Brittany, but never mind. But anyway, anything that ends in ac, to me, tells me that I'm in southwest France. So please, can we have the Lupiac?
Just for you, yes. It's a Lupiac Cuvée d'Or, Dauphin Rondillon from Bordeaux. And let's have a couple of those with our desserts, which have just arrived and look ridiculously amazing.
Wow. I would say one of the unusual discoveries for me, and I think yourself as well, in the series was 1 + 1 does not always equal 2. It could be 2 and a bit, or even 3 when it comes to food and wine.
You're talking about the curious incident of the curry at lunchtime.
Oh, yes. That's right. The curious incident of the curry. Wasn't that interesting?
Well, I'm going to declare this my favourite ep. There is not one that I haven't enjoyed immensely, but the logistics of getting all that food together, because of course we're not together. And so we had to get, both of us, a variety of cheeses, meats, a curry, and some risotto, and a few other bits and bobs together with 2 wines, keeping it all nice and warm and stuff. But it was worth it. And it was one of the moments of the season for me, because it was, wow, something happened there that I didn't expect or didn't know was possible. And that was, you get a lovely wine, you get a lovely food, you put them together and something else happens in your mouth and you create this third thing, which is a beautiful sensory bomb, which you didn't expect. Again, something I would have probably found a little bit pretentious, but if you really concentrate on what's going on in your gob hole and up your nasal, and rather down the hatch, say up the sinuses, to back reference your sinus thing. Wow. Yeah, it was just a lovely moment. A little bit like appreciating poetry for the first time, or classical music for the first time, or even rock and roll music for the first time, or painting for the first time. You're just like, I sort of start to get it. I want more.
And in terms of the series, that brings us full circle to Ep10 and where we are today, Chez Bruce and the rest. But take-home messages for you.
Well, from the whole season, yeah. Do you know what I really thought I would learn, which I haven't actually? And that's because I think my memory retention isn't great. And my daughter's a very good horse rider. And I've just started relearning. And we go round courses doing jumps. Neither of us can remember the order of the jumps. And I think our short-term memory retention is a bit whack. And it's obviously something slightly hereditary, and I apologise to her for that. I can't remember the names of the wines I really liked. I need to work on that, maybe in season 2, until I'm confident about using the wine list. I can't quite remember, what style I like and what goes with what. But what I have learnt is taking the time to really assess what is in your mouth and what is going up your nose pays dividends in terms of it being a beautiful sensual experience. And it reminds me of mindfulness, which is a very trendy thing that people are talking about these days. And some people are using it to meditate, to help them with problems like anxiety or being stressed, to really get in the moment. And a lot of mindfulness meditation, from what I've studied and actually attempted, is all about trying to understand, interpret, and just enjoy, without comment or judgment, the sensory inputs that are going into your brain. And it reminded me very much of that, when you're just sniffing the beautiful aromas that are coming off this fluid before sipping it and talking about it with a friend like you. And it's just a lovely thing to do, which I'd never really done or understood before. And although I haven't learnt so much about which is my favourite grape, what goes with what I like at lunch versus dinner, I have learnt to really appreciate the sort of sensual experience of having a really good wine. That's one thing. That's been worth doing the series, apart from spending time with you, of course, all by itself. I think the other thing that I would say, which is the big one, is what I'm calling the food bomb. That 1 + 1 = 3, as we've called it. You get a good wine, you get a good piece of food. There's some sort of alchemy happens in your mouth, and you get this thing which is almost greater than the sum of the parts. And at the very least, it's different. And again, a lovely sensory experience, which is sort of quite a surprise. It's like, ooh, where did that come from? Couple of other things I'd say. I've written down here the courage to describe what you taste. So you describe wines very practically in some ways, and then there's a sort of essence of what the wine is, or there's an abstraction of the taste into another. You'll say a wine is light, or you'll say a wine is uncomplicated. I'm starting to understand what those really rather abstract adjectives means, as opposed to fruity or nutty or spicy. I didn't really understand spicy until recently, and of course I've been able to use that on the port that we enjoyed this lunchtime. A couple of other things. One is the categorization of the way that you can describe the primary, secondary and tertiary. I love that, because I love categorization and understanding, what's actually going on in a scientific kind of systematic way. But what I've also learned is that there is no system, because it's a complex system. So it's not about rules or categories, it's about principles and just enjoying it.
And I really noticed that shift in your approach to wine during this series, Ol. Unsurprisingly, as you sort of just said, at the beginning particularly, you were bringing this very much a sort of categorization approach to wine. Quite rightly, I knew you would, and it's a good place to start because we can often feel comfortable with categorization. Things belong in places. Cells on spreadsheets or homes or pigeonholes or whatever you want to call it, and that's fine. It gives us confidence. It helps us understand. But I really noticed with you throughout the series how, yes, of course, classification is helpful, but it only gets you so far. And by the end of the series, where we are now, being systematic is great as an approach, but it only helps with principles. It cannot cover every aspect of wine. And that's why, going back to what we said right at the beginning, and why my wine journey has come on so quickly really in the past 5 years, is the intersection of all these different disciplines and the nuanced nature of it, which means that there are never hard and fast rules, and applying principles is the best way forward rather than trying to squeeze in rules. So, Ol, your favourite wines from the series, please?
I do find this tricky. I'd had to go back to my notes to remind myself, and that's one of the problems I still have. And I'm going to address that, which is just remembering what my favourites were. When it comes to music and bands, it's so easy. But when it comes to wine, it's maybe because I'm just getting into it. But I do remember some sort of signposting moments as we went through. I remember the Cabernet Franc, because I'd heard of Cabernet Sauvignon, and I remember you going Cabernet Franc, and I was thinking, oh my God, there's a whole load of Cabernets to learn as well now. But that was episode 2, and I loved it. And we revisited that yesterday as well, because we had the same grape, and it was lovely again.
When you smelt the red wine, you said, that smells amazing, and it reminded you of the Cab Franc from episode 2, because Cab Franc, at its best, has really fantastic aromatics. It was only part of the blend in yesterday's wine with Merlot, the Languedoc red that we had, but the one we tasted in episode 2 was 100% Cab Franc and was fantastic. Good call, Ol. What else have you got?
I've got to mention Dr. Lusing. And the Riesling in episode 4, because it was lovely. The sushi we had was lovely in the evening, and they just went together so well. So Riesling is something I am going to be a fan of, and that's one of the grapes I can remember. So if that's on the wine list, I would certainly give it time. Then the Gino Mavro, that was the Greek thing that we tasted as well, and that just absolutely blew me away. I remember I got a sniff of that, and then I got a mouthful of that, and I thought that is as good as anything from France. Absolutely lovely. And then moving on, the hermit crab. The hermit crab, again, knocked me out. It's a Viognier and something called Marsanne as well. And I like Viognier, but this Marsanne added something to it which took away some of the things of the Viognier I don't like.
I just remember that wine sticking out for its quality compared with the 2 reds that we were tasting in that app. So, yeah, good calls there, Ol. Any others?
It was the Beaujolais Village, which I didn't expect to like, because I always associated Beaujolais with sort of trend. But it was lovely, and it was Village, so it's quality, because I know what Village means. And it was a lighter red, and I'd been sort of brought up on heavier clarets and stuff, and I'm starting to realise that I sort of like a lighter red, I think would be my taste. So again, having said I haven't learned something about what I like, actually I have. I've learned I like Riesling, and I've learned I like a lighter red.
And I can see how with your sort of kind of being predominantly a white wine person, which you still are, I'm not surprised and delighted to realise how much you love that Beaujolais and the Gino Mavro. They're both quite on the lightish side, actually, although the Gino Mavro had quite a bit of tannin going on. It was delicious.
I suppose the last one, I'd have to add the Gewürztraminer, because that was my food bomb moment with the curry. And it was lovely on its own. With the curry, I had a Sri Lankan prawn curry, actually. Delicious.
Hard question now. If you could only take one white and one red to your desert island, which ones would they be?
Oh, Desert Island Booze Up. That is a radio program right there. Tricky, but impact on my mouth and senses. It would probably be 2 non-French wines. I would go for the Hermit Crab on the white, and I'd probably go for the Gino Mavro. The Gino Mavro from Greece on the red. Yeah, I think I'd probably be very happy with those 2 choices.
Fantastic.
So, Richard, same question to you. You can name your favourites, but what were the 2 that you'd pull out and take on your desert island with you?
Okay. First thing to say is Actually, I enjoyed all of them. Literally, I really, really enjoy all of them because I love wine so much, and it's the diversity that I just love. And we celebrate every time we have a different glass of wine. That's fine. For one white, one red for my desert island, it would be Chablis Premier Cru for my white wine on the desert island, and the red wine, it would be a toss-up between the Rioja Reserva and the Gigondas. Much as I love Gigondas, I'm such a sucker for the old-style oaked, quite heavily oaked, coconutty American oak influence. I would go for the Reserva Rioja from España. Thank you very much.
So a fairly decent spread, I reckon. Spain, France, Greece and Australia, both hemispheres served. Old world, new world served. And a lovely quartet of wines.
I think we need to draw this to a close now, old Bean. It's the end of episode 10. I'm not feeling as sad now as I was in episode 9 when I realised Ep10, the final ep, was coming up. Maybe it's because I can have a break from editing and planning episodes. But just to say, I don't think we need to talk about it now, but I've got a feeling we're going to be back. Is that right?
Yeah, 100%. We've already, as you know, made plans. We're talking to people because we'd like to get some guests on. Guests that share our passion for wine, but our overriding passion for enjoying the damn stuff. And there are plenty of people out there who've got some great stories to tell. So yes, 100% we will be back, which is why I'm not sad. And I know now guaranteed I'll be spending a lot more time with my friend Richard, with whom I have to thank enormously for adding to my education, spending some time with me and making this project a success so far. What a hoot it has been, Richard. Thank you a million, my friend.
Oliver, you are most welcome. The Wine List Season 1 is now over. Grab yourself a glass of 10-year-old Tawny Port if you can at some point. Smell the Christmas cake and the Christmas pudding in the making and just look into the bottom of your glass and think, life ain't too bad, really.